We always wait 3 minutes.
Yeah, I think we can wait a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm gonna start showing up late then. It starts.
I think we can start. Or do you want to wait a little bit more?
Oh, we're 5 after. I think it's okay to start. Other people can trickle in if they show up.
Yeah. So let me tell you what was discussed on the EU meeting. So quick recap. So the group discussed annotation idea that you sent Vanessa from Christian presentation, and there are some comments. Zvonko from NVIDIA said that it's not ideal for confidential computing where the whole image manifest is encrypted. So it might be a little bit problematic. Also, Zvonko is the person who will represent all NVIDIA interest and cover all use cases, answering Brandon's question last time about who will represent NVIDIA. And the group prefers to create a standalone independent artifact that points to the image manifest. And people there were quite enthusiastic about Vanessa's idea to create a framework that allows everybody to bring their own use cases. And there were also some comment about the validation tool. That would be the best if the group can come up also with a tool developed by us and that allows to execute plugins, scanners, or whatever you call it, that helps stakeholders to validate their use cases. So everything what we discussed last time, EU group doesn't have, it's not against, it's just that there is not much interest in annotation way, more they are interested in the artifact way.
Awesome. So I put together, so I can start. I put together sort of a proposal that actually has 3 different ideas, the artifact being one of them. And if it's okay with others, can I share that and kind of walk through some things?
Sure.
Okay. Should I share my screen or should I share a link? What is preferred?
Maybe you can share your screen, that would be the best.
Okay, let's try that. I will be blinded by the light of Google Docs. Come on, cursor. It's not letting me click it. Alrighty, let's make this a little bit bigger. Is that large enough?
Yeah.
Okay. So we started with use cases. We've mostly talked about these. These are very simple. Checking the architecture compatibility. This is with ArchSpec. This is from Christian's talk, really asking this question: how was this image built, and how do I best prepare it for the execution environment? And that really extends from applications to workflows and performance. Let's see, expected. Yeah, and so one thing that I'm going to talk a little bit about later is I think we need to kind of set a boundary or scope about what we are defining for the working group here. At some point, for example, there's going to be some kind of artifact thing, separate thing that that is parsed for metadata, and then some tool has to do that parsing. How deep are we going into specifying, the actual tool, how the tool is structured, the process? But I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I came up with some definitions. I'm not sure these are very important, but we are designing the spec, the OCI compatibility spec. I'm calling it a compatibility interest group, some vested interest group that wants to define compatibility for themselves, for their particular community. And then what they define is the compatibility definition, saying, okay, this is based on these annotations. This is how we say that this particular container is compatible for this use case. So the way that that I described this, and Christian added the idea that well, I added details to it, but we both added different designs. So the first one is what you just talked about, and it sounds like that's not desired. This is what I call organizing the Wild West, and that is just taking advantage of the annotations. I added some examples here from HPC. It sounds like this would be the most direct and simple case, but it also sounds like, based on the feedback that you just gave, this is not what we want. So I am going to skip it over. And I put these points that you just said right here. So the next design is having an artifact that's referenced in an image manifest. But to go back to this point here, if the image manifest is encrypted, it sounds like that would still be problematic to have to look up the reference to the artifact. Is that correct?
I've always thought about the other way around, that in the compatibility artifact, you have a subject that points to image manifest, and you can discover the artifact or images over that way. I'm not sure if I'm correct.
I wanted to clarify on the encrypted manifest part, because everything I've heard and seen on encrypted manifest is that they are encrypting the layers and not the manifest itself. And they really can't encrypt the manifest itself because the registries process that. It's a well-known format that if the registry doesn't recognize the content, it just refuses it.
If I remember correctly today, Zvonko was talking about encrypted annotations as well. So I would require a clarification from here, I think.
The layers themselves are encrypted, and the annotations on the layers have the details of how to decrypt it. And so it is encrypted content. You have to decrypt it with your own key, and then you use that to decrypt the layer. So there is detail in the annotations of the layers, but that's different from the annotations in the image. So yeah, I would want some clarification there as well.
Okay, I will reach Zonka and ask about that. Maybe he can answer on the mailing list. But still, even if we skip the encryption of the image itself, of the manifest, there are still some concerns about putting the compatibility into annotations. One of those is just flattening the data and bringing more complex use cases.
Yeah, my next question was going to be, even if the encryption isn't an issue, are there still enough other issues that the annotation path is sort of not desired more generally?
Also, there was a concern about if you have a more complex release cycle of the image itself, and you have, like, I don't know, some new compatibility changes over time because of new hardware release or some adjustments, you have to run the whole process, certification, signing of the image, and so on again, which sometimes it's not like trivial. Depends on the company and industry, but if for metadata update, people would like to avoid that.
So I'll throw a counter thought on that, which is that if you can change the way a runtime treats an image after the fact with unsigned data, that might be a concern from people that want to have only signed content being run.
Yeah, but if I've understood you correctly, it will not always change the runtime, right? My point is that
if the idea here is that we're going to pass additional metadata in there that runtimes can use to change their behavior, and they're going to pick different images and different, options based on what this metadata says, having that be unsigned data that you pass after the fact, I think someone would have a concern with.
That's the thing we have to discuss as well, because from my point of view, we shouldn't really change metadata that influence image selection. To be honest, I would just leave it maybe as it is, or extend maybe some CPU information for image selection. However, all this kernel configuration or other stuff should be like handled by other tools. To be honest, I imagine this that way. If you want to run if you have image with artifact that describes compatibility, first you run some external tool that we can come up and check if host is valid or not. I wouldn't like to like I don't know. I wouldn't like to trigger some runtime that does this for you. To be honest, I just wanted to keep this compatibility completely separated and optional. That doesn't change the way how you run containers today, unless you have a good reason to extend the platform object for image selection. But I want to keep this as really minimum. Does it make sense what I describe, or should I clarify something?
It might be good for us to define exactly what the output of the group is going to be, because I think some people are looking at this and saying we were going to use it for image selection. Some people are looking at it and saying we're going to use it for node selection. Sounds like you're taking a third position of the runtime should just be able to use this to decide whether or not it should be running the image, or maybe not even that.
Yeah, yeah, we have to discuss that. What's the expectations? But as I think this also answers the Bjorn concern at the beginning, why he didn't want to bring this kernel versioning and all of this stuff, because I think he was concerned to put this stuff into image manifest itself and make the image selection more complicated, right? So yeah, I personally treat this compatibility stuff as something completely optional outside of runtime. And if you want to validate if image is compatible, do it on your own by the tools we provide, and runtime shouldn't take part into that. That's how I see that, at least.
What's the overall user workflow you're envisioning?
First, for example, a cluster admin that is running, because we have this validation center in telco use cases, that you have engineers that validate if specific image is compatible with hosts. And so to do that, you could run the tool, reconfigure the cluster if it's required by the artifact, and then run images in there. Also, if you like to influence Kubernetes scheduler with that information, you could write a scheduler plugin or write some admission webhooks that pull the artifacts and maybe modify the pod node selector and so on. So we first come up with this validation of the host and the image itself, and then run containers later. We don't require that it happens on the runtime. Like, for example, you run Docker run and then you have the output, your container is not validated. We have to take a step ahead with this validation. That's our use case, at least.
Okay, provisioning infrastructure, that's a whole third use case that I don't think we've really captured in the previous discussions. So
yeah, because our use case is often like we receive a lot of images from different vendors. We are not author of those images, and we have to somehow validate and run those on the clusters. So we need some kind of tooling to validate those use cases, and the compatibility should be written by image authors, because they know always the best how it should run, and it should be delivered in a standard way for end users, which is us in that case, that runs these containers. So yeah, that's why this idea of compatibility was created by.
Yeah, I had a little bit, so we can go back to these two ideas, but basically to summarize quickly, the other two ideas were basically, okay, instead create artifacts and either have the artifact kind of referenced within the image manifest, which sounds not ideal, versus have the subject of the artifact point back to the image manifest, which sounds better. I want to answer Brandon's question with respect to workflow. I was thinking that we offload a little bit of responsibility for adding a lot of, well, generating artifacts, whatever it means to generate these compatibility specifications to the build tools. So whether that's like exactly at the time of the build or something that's done after, you can imagine that our group comes up with a kind of plugin framework where we define like the structure that a tool author, so someone that the ArchSpec community can use to implement their plugin that could be added to whatever the build tool of choice. There's also, at least in HPC, there's many package managers that can easily do this. So for example, SPAC, easy build. And then for a user use case, then we might have sort of a separate tool. So I just called it comp tool because I'm incredibly not creative with naming. But then the idea is that we would design, again, what the structure of a plugin looks like. So you'd say, okay, comp tool, add plugin for the ArchSpec compatibility, add one for, I don't know, spec compatibility. And then basically you would use that tool to dump an artifact or whatever it happens to be that describes compatibility for your specific thing. And then you would push it somewhere or whatever it happens to be. And then post build, I still think it should be possible to kind of edit or add to these artifacts post build. So maybe, I guess in the annotation sense, you could imagine a tool like Crane adding annotations, but in the artifact sense, we would again provide some kind of tool to do that. And when I was working on this, it kind of occurred to me like this whole process of defining the specification for what an artifact looks like, and then having some kind of workflow where something happens at build time or something happens at post build time and something happens at pull time. Maybe at pull time, there is another tool that allows you to do some kind of validation or compatibility tests. What is the scope of what our group is working on? Where do we start and where do we end? And I think that's an important question because we're just going to be like all over the place if we don't figure out the answer to that.
Yeah, something we did with the refers working group is we started out with a bunch of use cases people were documenting. And so I think, Marcin, you've got yours. Vanessa, you've got yours. I think I've got my own in here. Might be good to start putting those together, documenting, okay, here are all the different use cases people envision for how we're going to use this and what goals we have to get out of this working group.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I already started the document how I would see that all of the stuff use cases and started to kind of creating some language for this artifact and how it should cover all use cases and so on, and that people can bring anything they want there. But I need a little bit more time. Last week I wasn't able to pull everything together, so I put into our agenda item that we have a framework proposals, progress deadlines, and so on. So I would like to propose that we have maybe 2 weeks deadline to create a pull request into working group repository. And after the deadline, we can meet, discuss, and present the ideas and see how this is gonna evolve. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, should we have a template that describes what should be in that request? So for example, the use cases and like what design of what, just so people know exactly what to do.
Yes, that's a good idea. That's a good idea to have some kind of template.
Something we did before we came out with the proposals and the reference types is we started with the use cases. And so that gave the people writing proposals their goals of what they were trying to cover, different problems.
Did we do the use cases first then? PR number 1, use cases.
Okay.
That's kind of what I'm thinking, is to go through and have everybody say, I want this to be able to do that. And I suspect, given what we're talking about here, we're going to find that it's impossible to have all the use cases covered by any one solution. We've got conflicting use cases effectively.
Yeah, I suspect though there'll be use cases where, let's say someone says, I want to do, X, Y, and Z. We'll say like, well, we'll provide the artifact, the metadata, so you can do X, but we cannot cover Z because it's very niche, but you can make your own tool to do that. So we're going to have to establish some boundaries.
Yeah.
And I have a quick question. So you said that people were kind of wary of using artifacts because of, it's limited, or sorry, wary of using annotations, but isn't an artifact just an image manifest with an artifact type and then like most of the same metadata? So would we be designing like an extension or some updated representation of an artifact? Like, is the idea that when we use the term artifact, we're talking about something generic that we haven't designed yet?
Yeah, I mean, from the EU group perspective and my own perspective, one of the most important things for us is just this is independent object of the image manifest, that we don't have to create a new build each time the compatibility changes, meaning you don't have new digests on the cluster and so on, and you only trigger image builds only with important release changes, maybe not always important, but patch or whatever. So that's one view on that. And yeah, it also would be easier to update and extend the artifacts in the future, and keeping everything in annotations, because when I saw presentation from Christian, if you look at the key and values, if you have, for example, list objects or whatever, it's very flattened, right? So each time you write some kind of tool for that, it might be a little bit difficult, and it might be for us much easier to come up with artifact to have a like self-contained language that you describe compatibility. Personally, I thought to create something like we have, like Unreal Engine 5 has for programming games these days, which are blueprints that you connect, the objects itself. So I thought about you have this blueprint specific for kernel configuration version and so on. Inside blueprint, you describe how you want to validate those stuff, and you also describe in the blueprint how you connect those stuff between each other. So basically, yeah, that's how we think about that, and that's why we don't like annotations too much, because I think it's kind of limited for extension. Also, there was an idea from Joe that in the future, if we have OCI compatibility artifact, you could allow people to attach into layers some plugins that they will execute to check if image is compatible or not. But it's just an idea, right? And there's a lot of concerns around that, like security and so on. But yeah.
If the plugin's like a container, we're gonna have to check that one too, because then we're gonna go into like an infinite recursion thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't want to go too much into the details, but I do have just a follow-up question just for interest. So in this vision where you have an artifact that's like Unreal Engine, would you imagine that there is just one artifact per container? And so if you want to update that, you update that. That is like the source of truth, as opposed to having many. I talked to Brandon briefly about this in the Slack, and we realized that we want the lookup to be like O of 1 in terms of like finding the artifact, as opposed to like every new tool add a new artifact, and then you have to like have a million artifacts to search through. Sounds like a bad idea.
Yeah, I thought about having one artifact per one image. That's how I see that.
How would you limit? Particularly because a lot of registries don't let you delete content from the normal delete API. They might have their own custom one.
So
if at all.
that means you will have to each time you build a new image, you have to build a new artifact in that case. Do I understand correctly? That you end up with
to make a second artifact to an image and make that the only one, you would have to replace the image so that you would only have one artifact, because otherwise the old artifact is still there pointing to your image.
I see. So we would have to have some new artifacts, that bunch of artifacts that points to different builds, right? We cannot have just one to the latest or something like that.
There is nothing saying you're only allowed to have one of these things pointing to the image in the spec. It's specifically designed around there can be more than one, and it's up to the client to figure out how to pick and choose from a list of multiple.
See. Yeah, so that would be another thing to figure out, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and another thing to figure out is just with respect to permissions. So let's say NVIDIA is maintaining containers, but someone has a niche use case and they want to add their compatibility spec to it. They can't push to the NVIDIA repository, and maybe NVIDIA doesn't even care about their use case, so they can't convince them to do it. how do we still allow for, I don't know, someone storing maybe a separate artifact in their own registry that could still reference the right container? Like that seems like it's a use case that is likely to come up.
But in that case, because this problem appears in so many different fields, right? Not only in that case. So I wouldn't do any exceptions for that. If you don't have access to, if you cannot clone the image and build your own artifact that points to this to your clone, then you have a problem. And the only way you can deal with that is just to contact NVIDIA and ask them to do something about that. It's all, the problem was always there, right? With the all software we have, with licensing and so on. And I think we cannot kind of solve it.
Yeah, my thinking was that if we have some kind of tool or plugins that do the check, you could allow someone to point to any image, any compatibility artifact, and still do the check on their own, even if it's not sort of an official compatibility artifact provided by NVIDIA. So they're not blocked to doing, you know, I don't know. There's a lot of use cases I can think of where that might happen, and I think there should be a way, even if it's not like the best way.
But I find this a little bit problematic, because if you release image with artifact and you sign those, and yeah, how we do, by the way, how we verify all of this stuff. For example, if you have signature for the artifact, um, then you have provide some another artifact that is not signed appropriately, and then you cannot basically trust this. So
Yeah, I guess
yeah,
what I'm thinking, I can give a concrete example. So let's say that you're running a workflow with SnakeMake. That's a workflow engine in Python. And SnakeMake has its own registry of artifacts that describe wrappers in the workflow. A wrapper is just like a particular step you might run to, I don't know, run SAM tools or VWA align or whatever. The SnakeMake, SnakeMake itself may use its own registry to pull down an artifact about a particular wrapper or about a container or something. And so SnakeMake is less concerned about, I guess, the signing part, because it's pulling from its own registry, but it wants to still be able to validate against a container that that's from NVIDIA. I think that's a valid use case, but NVIDIA is not going to take SnakeMake's compatibility artifact, for the biosciences.
yeah, that's a valid use case as well. To be honest, I don't have answer to that. I mean, what is, from my own perspective, if I would have such a use case, either I would build, if it's possible to build, clone the image and build my own artifact and so on, or just trigger NVIDIA forks to do something about that. I don't see like the third way.
Yeah,
That's
I guess what I'm thinking is that whatever artifact we design, we should make it possible for someone to pull down an image they're interested in, do the extraction, basically generate their own artifact and put their own artifact somewhere for their own use. Like we shouldn't. Brandon, why don't you go ahead?
I was just going to interject that the detached signature use case on the signing of images is a use case people are considering. There's massive debate right now going on over on the other side of OCI of how, all that sort of stuff around whether we should be doing that. But the use case is very much that a third party wants to be able to sign content. And so you might have some kind of independent auditor. You might have a security department, their own team, and they want to have their own repo that only they have access to. And the tooling out there can be told that you are verifying the signature, go to this other repo to do it. And so it's a configuration on the client side that says, go verify from this other location, pull down the content from there from this image, for this image.
Yeah, there's also us still off in janky land that still aren't using signatures in a way that we should meaningfully. So
but that same workflow of let's have a detached signature could have detached annotations for other stuff. Like I say, it's under strong debate right now over on the other side of OCI. And so realize that that use case may or may not be supported long term, depending on how this stuff all plays out over there.
And so speaking additionally about that, about what you described the document, Vanessa, do you consider that image selection part is also taken into account by your idea? Like for example, if you have the second option with an artifact where you describe everything, do you consider that all of this data you describe in the artifact are considered by runtime as well?
You mean the janky use case, or you mean just the document that I was sharing?
The document you are sharing.
Hmm.
Because I wonder how do you treat that? Like for example, you write this image compatibility that it can also describe image selection or not, or it's something very separated from that.
So I guess how do you distinguish image selection? So let's say I do a poll and there's some kind of decision about whether this is the right one to pull because I don't want to waste all my poll time, pulling the wrong one. And then for the runtime, you're saying like right before running it, it might check like compatibility of like,
yeah,
and it's metadata about MPI in the container and an MPI in the host. And you're asking if those are two different things or two different steps. I
yeah.
guess
Uh-huh.
so. I guess there's a couple. It could be done at the same time. Like if before I pull a container, I would probably want to know if the MPI is going to work on my host or if it's sort of the best one to do. So you could argue that the runtime step actually happens at the same time as the previous one. But I think let's say there's use cases where you're pretty certain about a container, so you pull it. But then there's some kind of use case where you actually want to like check it now that you have the container. And I think Christian mentioned this in his talk as well, but there could be, again, another sort of plugin setup where you're able to then do another check, sort of like a smoke test of the container against your environment, whatever, to ensure. So that could be something else that the group designs a way to do that compatibility check or smoke test once you have the container. That also seems kind of risky, but yeah, I don't I'm not a security person, but I figure once you pull the container and you're planning to run it, like you're already taking that risk.
So maybe as Brandon mentioned, we should probably come up with those use cases and workflows how we see that, because from my own perspective, we have kind of clear workflow paths and what we want to achieve from that, and we don't want to mess with image selection too much if possible, and we want to keep it as optional as possible and self-sufficient as possible without influencing the way how it works right now, the whole OCI stuff. So yeah, let's just maybe come up for the next meeting with bunch of documents or pull requests to the repository with our own use cases that we can debate over that.
Okay, so you're saying that first step that I was describing when you actually decide to pull, we shouldn't be mucking with that.
Yes.
We should be focusing on the step afterward once we maybe have the container and then there's an additional check that's done. Is that correct?
Even before, because I was hoping that if we have like the name of the image and digest, you can somehow discover the artifact before you pull it, and first you execute the validation stuff, and later, if everything is okay, you pull the image itself and run it. So everything must happen before you pull and run the image.
Okay, so go ahead, Brandon.
I was going to say, my understanding of Marston's use case is that he'll have a single platform image, and he's going to use that with a cluster provisioning tool to decide what kind of cluster to provision. Is that?
Yeah, it's one of the use cases as well. Yes.
Yeah,
Cluster provisioning.
Which is a very different direction from where I think a lot of us have been coming from this.
But it's not only cluster provisioning involved as well, but also even if you have already provisioned cluster, the node configuration can be part there as well. So for example, if you have cluster of 1000 nodes and you have a specific telco application that brings you a router in a container, so you have to make or add 6 additional nodes with specific configuration, and those configuration will be influenced by image compatibility.
But in any of those use cases, would you ever have multiple images for an Intel x86 platform in the same multi-platform manifest list, or would you only ever have one in your use case?
It can be multiple. It can be multiple. So that's why, if I understand you correctly, that's why we want to have artifact that points to the specific image manifest that yeah, that basically we don't keep it in the index annotations or whatever, the whole compatibility, but we can describe the specific platform, and image selection still can take place. Like, for example, if you have bunch of nodes, of course not on one cluster, but if you have bunch of nodes on ARM or x86 or whatever, so you still have to describe compatibility for ARM and x86. So you have image index with two images there. And that's why we also don't want to mess a little bit with this selection. We don't want to put all of this data and make part, maybe I will rephrase, we don't want to bring this compatibility spec into image manifest to not make image selection more complicated, because you would have to come up with so many image builds that it can go really crazy. Like, for example, you have, yeah?
I think that's where I was going with the question of, could you have multiple images that were both x86, AMD 64, something like that, in the same manifest? Because if you had multiple, then you would be doing some kind of image selection, unless you were doing that centrally and only sending down a single platform image to individual runners.
That's what we want to avoid. We don't want to have multiple images for the same platform. If, for example, you have one image that can run differently on different CPUs, then compatibility should allow you to express configuration for specific CPU. That we don't want to bring this kind of stuff into image selection, because that would be really hard to maintain.
Yeah, I think to play devil's advocate, the HPC use case, there's many other variables that you actually would need to consider. And so you would have, for example, multiple ARM or multiple x86 that you to choose from. And I don't know how that would fit into the model that you're describing.
It depends on what kind of stuff you would like to put there. If it's only CPU information, for instance, I would think of like, you can have multiple x86 images with CPU details. However, if you don't set them, you just go up to the root and take whatever it's there, as with the arch spec, right, that you described. So that's my point. We can extend the platform object with maybe some CPU information, but we have to think this through and put there only significant and important information, information that you cannot change easily. So, for example, kernel configuration doesn't fit there because it can be easily replaceable. CPU features are not easily replaceable, so maybe it makes sense to put this kind of stuff into image selection. So, yeah, when I think about what should be there in the image, in the platform object and CPU stuff, I think only about things that are not configurable, not easily replaceable, stuff that you can not, change easily, like CPU, platform, microarchitecture, and so on. So maybe those kind of stuff makes sense to put there.
Okay, so it sounds like part of the proposal that you're making would be actually to add a few new metadata fields to the platform. Okay, yeah, I think that's reasonable.
Yeah, but for example, if I understood correctly the presentation, the MPI version could be easily changed. So I wouldn't put this into image selection.
Well, what do you mean it could be easily changed?
Maybe not easily, but it's changeable, right? Like can be reinstalled or something.
Yeah, so how would it be reinstalled? Would it be like a multi-stage build that totally, I guess in practice you're not going to build a container and then even do a multi-stage build and just like change the MPI version. And honestly, like MPI is like the biggest gripe that I have experienced when it comes to containers and HPC, like getting it right.
Okay.
So I think that's an example actually of something that is not that most would not consider putting in like the platform object, but it's important, and it's fairly hard coded in terms of needing to know the metadata when you're pulling the image, because it can just have huge impact for performance or just working at all.
So, for example, would it be possible that you have some kind of tool before you do image selection, or maybe after even? Is it possible that some kind of software is annotating your nodes or something like that, and then schedule containers on appropriate API version or so? Do you get my idea, or should I elaborate a little bit on that?
Elaborate a little bit. I mean, you could have, when you say nodes, you mean like Kubernetes nodes that with annotations?
Yeah, it could be something like that. Yes, doesn't have to be Kubernetes, but the general idea that, because when I think about compatibility, how the scheduler could be influenced. Before you run pods, you intercept the image, figure out the artifact for that, read what kind of stuff is there. Like, so for example, if you have kernel version or so, you check what kind of nodes has a specific kernel annotation version in there, and you influence how pods should be scheduled on the cluster itself. So I thought about something similar for MPI, if it's possible for you to have something like that, if MPI version is not in the image selection.
So so you're saying that you would get that would be in some kind of artifact object that you get after the image selection, and you would just know if you can schedule it to the nodes or not. So potentially you could
go ahead. Even before. Sorry, even before.
Because, oh yeah, because it's like image selection and then the compatibility step and then the pull, right?
Not because you have the name of the image and the tag. So if you, for example, because for example, you can know ahead the architecture, so you can kind of predict what kind of image will be selected for you. So you don't have to wait for the image selection part, in my opinion. You can have this information ahead and know which image will be selected. So you can do it on your own, check if you discover the artifact, check the compatibility, and then you let the whole mechanism to run. So it means image selection will take place and then it will run.
So if you don't have nodes that have the correct annotation for your MPI, then you're just in trouble. And yes. Are you sort of suggesting that metadata about which image select should be in the tag, as we sort of do now, which is kind of messy, but
no. I wouldn't like to have this. Like, I think Windows has like that right now. We should avoid this kind of stuff. So yeah, we should, in my opinion, extend this image selection part only with crucial stuff, but not too much, and try to somehow predict where this container can run on the cluster or on the hosts ahead, because we can even replicate the image selection algorithm, because I think it's not so complicated, right, Brandon? It's just taking the first that fits and based on the platform fields.
It's the first that matches unless you have some reason to know otherwise. And so that's why when I hear Vanessa talking about her use cases, I wonder if we need a generic way to tell runtimes how they can determine something better matches their use case locally without having to make a custom runtime for MPI to be able to inject into the local runtime on a certain machine of saying, hey, if you see this annotation, that's preferred for me. And then you could have the MPI annotation on your images, and you just know, okay, every time it says 3.5, that's the one I want for my machine. Pick that one out of the list.
Yeah, it almost feels like we need a way to allow for some kind of customization there too. Because yeah, I guess that's a hard problem to tackle. It makes it much more kind of scope, but I don't have an answer, but I can say that that's very important in HPC land.
Yeah, the direction I'm leaning is much less that we dictate all the different combinations of MPI or any other software out there, and more that we define here is how people can interact between the container image that's been pushed and the runtimes they're using, that they've got all the knobs they need to turn, and they can turn into whatever values they want to for their own cases without us defining all those knobs.
Yeah, I like that. It's the skeleton idea.
Yeah, sounds good. So from my own side, I would prepare some kind of maybe pull request maybe with our own use cases in telco, how we see how, for example, you work with images, what our use cases, what's the output, and so on. So we can start with that and then think about the framework proposals.
So, Marcin, unless Annie made you the owner of the repo, I think there's still a few last details for us to get the repo fully set up for us to do. So there's a little bit there. Maybe it'll happen today, maybe it'll take a little longer.
Okay. Even there, if the repo is not ready or so, I can still come up. Everybody can come up with documents, so it should be good enough.
Okay, would it be possible to have a template for use cases and so just instructions like, okay, put them in this directory, write in this format, just so it's not like a crazy Wild West where everyone submits something different.
I think that's why I want to get access to the repo that we can just start filling out a document in there.
Action item, give Brandon access, let him do his thing. He knows what's up, man.
Well, what we did with the refers working groups, we just had a document for all the use cases and it was a bulleted list. And then everybody just went in there and just started adding their own bullets. Before we put that into GitHub, though, we did just have a Google Doc that everybody had access to and we were just writing in there willy-nilly. That might be an easy way to get started.
Oh yeah, I like that too. Then we can like do comments and ask questions. I like that.
Cool. Sounds good. So maybe, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, should we somehow capture the previous discussion? Because I mean, it seemed that it floated quite a lot of ideas whether this is going to be affecting the scheduler or the nodes or whatnot. And I remember from last week an HPC use case that, yeah, you had some kind of I don't know, you need to connect this to a device that has a specific PCI device to connect to your, I don't know, particle accelerator or whatnot kind of thing. And that, of course, definitely needs to define that which nodes are going to receive this nice image that has such a requirement. So I'm just wondering if we have a little bit of a, I don't know, is anybody capable of typing down the previous discussion so that we can actually also figure out that how much of this needs to hit the scheduler or hit the runtime who makes the final decision whether this was a working solution or not. When we start off with an image and we want to have it to run somewhere or select the image based on something else.
Sorry, go ahead, Vanessa.
You're asking if someone can write down some of these more complex HPC use cases in the context of a runtime or a scheduler?
Or actually, I mean, how do you see them? We sort of started off, we have an image, we have some kind of specification of it, and actually, yes, this is something that either gets selected. If it gets selected, it needs to run with its constraints. And the worst one was actually from last week. It was that you had a specific PCI device that needs to be present in order for this image to be properly executing whatever it's supposed to be doing. So do we have a gap in this one? Because we have, yes, we can specify things, but how do we from start to finish, how do we?
That's the thing we're trying to figure out right now.
Yeah. That was the discussion. I was like wondering do we manage to capture this so I can still remember it day after tomorrow? That what we ended up with which problems did we end up with in that case or all the cases?
I will say we do have the meeting notes in there, so I dropped the link and I tried to at least capture the 3 high level, which was cluster provisioning, node selection, and image selection from a list. And I feel like that covers the 3 main areas people are thinking about attacking us from. And I was going to have one more comment on top of all of this, which is that we might end up with more than one output from this working group. We might have an output that's used for image selection by runtime and a different output for cluster provisioning. And one might be an annotation that's attached to the image, and one might be something that goes into the platform object. So may not have to have one solution that solves everything.
Okay, so next steps, is it possible to, let's see, I think it's a good idea to maybe start with a Google Doc for some of these use cases so we can kind of hack it together, ask each other questions. In parallel, can someone give Brandon super user access to the repository? So he can, I think it would make sense to start preparing some of the structure, some of the templates. So then maybe next week we'll come in and we can talk about our Google Doc, and then we'll move that into the repository. Then we'll have a nice set of use cases in the repository. And then with the template for a proposal, that will give us structure to then do the original thing that was proposed, which is to actually write up individual proposals that we can discuss as a group.
Sounds good.
The Google Doc we can do ourselves. So anybody here wants to start one of those up, that'd be good. Marcin, can I throw that on your to-do list?
Yes, sure. I can
just open one up, share it with the team. And in terms of getting access and their admin access, that's an Amy task. And so she commented that we should ping her on the image on the issue, and I already did that, but I'll send her a message later on now that it's Monday and everybody hates Mondays and people bug.
I know it's Monday after like Thanksgiving. Nobody wanted to wake up today.
Maybe I can even, Vanessa, sync with you tomorrow about this Google template use cases and so on, that maybe you would have some input. And yeah, let's get this stuff done.
Let's get this ball rolling.
I also had one more topic. We just keep on Europe talk. I already submitted talk about OCI image compatibility, current status and expectations with Joe. We want to just present to Kubernetes community where do we stand and what are the expectations. However, if you would like to, anybody from the group, join the talk, then we could transform this to panel. So it would be up to you if you are interested to coming to Paris. And first of all, we have to get the talk accepted. And if you are interested, if anybody is interested to transform this into panel, then you can reach me on Slack and I can edit. I hope I still can edit this proposal there. So yeah, just saying that there is such a possibility.
Yeah, I would probably be limited to virtual participation, which doesn't fly at KubeCon unless it's pre-recorded, so the panel would not work. But I think that's a great idea if others are interested.
Okay, guys, so by the end of tomorrow, I should come up with some Google Doc, first draft or something like that. And yeah, I guess that's it.
That sounds great. Meeting adjourned. Bang, bang, bang. The imaginary gavel.
The Google Doc doesn't have to be fancy. Just use cases, bullet, and then let us start filling things in.
Okay.
Alrighty, thanks everyone. Have a great Monday and we'll chat later.
Okay, bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.